This photograph has never been published. Its existence has never been confirmed. Yet multiple witnesses have sworn under oath that they saw it. Private investigators have spent fortunes searching for it. At least 3 men connected to its alleged location died under mysterious circumstances in the years following that dinner. The photograph represents everything that made this woman dangerous, not her body, not her fame, but her position at the intersection of Hollywood glamour, political authority, and organized crime. To understand how a stuttering foster child from Los Angeles ended up at a table that could topple governments, we must travel backward, before the platinum hair, before the breathy voice, before the name that would become synonymous with American desire. We return to a time when none of it existed, to a little girl who learned, before she could read, that survival meant becoming exactly what others wanted to see, even if it meant erasing herself completely. Los Angeles General Hospital, June 1, 1926. A woman gives birth alone in a charity ward, 24 years old, unmarried, trembling as she fills out the paperwork. Under father, she writes Edward Mortensen, a man who abandoned her months ago and wants nothing to do with this child. It is a lie, but not the only one on the form. The real father she knows is C. Stanley Gifford, her supervisor at Consolidated Film Industries. He has made clear he wants no part of her or the baby. So she writes a dead man's name and hands her daughter to the nurses. Gladys Pearl Baker named her daughter Norma Jeane, a pretty name, a hopeful name. But hope was not something the Baker family knew much about. What they knew was madness. Gladys's mother, Della, had died in an asylum after a complete mental collapse. Her father, Otis, had died in an asylum. Her brother Marion had died in an asylum. 4 generations of the same blood, 4 descents into darkness. Little Norma Jeane entered the world carrying a genetic time bomb in her veins. Though she could not know it yet, she would spend her entire life wondering when her own mind would betray her. Gladys worked as a film negative cutter at Consolidated Film Industries. Every day, she handled strips of celluloid containing manufactured images, faces that smiled on command, emotions produced for cameras, beauty created in darkrooms, surrounded by illusion professionally while her personal reality crumbled. Beautiful herself with dark hair and sharp features, but her beauty was brittle. Something behind her eyes flickered like a faulty light bulb. The doctors would later call it paranoid schizophrenia. The neighbors simply called her troubled. The Bolender family lived in Hawthorne, a working-class town south of Los Angeles. Albert and Ida Bolender were evangelical Christians who took in foster children for the state-provided stipend of $5 per week. They were not cruel, but warmth was absent. Ida Bolender believed in discipline, order, and the inherent sinfulness of the human body. She taught little Norma Jeane that vanity was a pathway to damnation, that desire was corruption, that a good girl kept her eyes down and her thoughts clean. The child developed a severe stutter during these years, words caught in her throat like fish bones. When she tried to speak, her mouth would twist and freeze, producing broken syllables that made other children laugh. Teachers grew impatient. Ida Bolender saw the stutter as defiance, a refusal to speak properly. She punished the girl for lying when she was telling the truth, washing her mouth with soap for offenses she did not commit. The stutter worsened. Norma Jeane began to dream, not of being an actress, not yet, simply of being seen, of being someone whose face mattered, whose words came out whole, whose existence was not a burden to be passed from house to house. In 1933, when Norma Jeane was 7 years old, something miraculous happened. Gladys came to take her home. For 11 months, the girl lived with her mother in a small white bungalow in Hollywood. Gladys had saved enough money to make a down payment, had furnished the rooms modestly, had even purchased a white baby grand piano that gleamed in the living room like a promise. It was the only beautiful thing Norma Jeane would remember from her childhood. She would stroke the ivory keys, not knowing how to play but loving the cool smoothness beneath her fingertips. This was what home felt like. This was what being wanted meant. Then Gladys's mind shattered. It happened gradually, then all at once. Gladys began talking about people who lived in the walls. She accused neighbors of spying, mailmen of conspiracy. She stopped sleeping, stopped eating, stopped recognizing her own daughter. One afternoon, men in white coats came to the bungalow. They took Gladys away while she screamed about enemies and plots. Norma Jeane stood in the doorway, 8 years old, watching her mother disappear into the back of an ambulance. She collapsed like a puppet whose strings were cut, the actress would recall decades later. One moment she was my mother, the next she was nobody, and I was alone again. Gladys Pearl Baker would spend most of the remaining years of her life in institutions. She would outlive her legendary daughter by many years, dying in 1984 without ever fully understanding what Norma Jeane had become. The white piano was sold. The bungalow was lost. The little girl was delivered to the Los Angeles Orphans Home Society, where she would remain for the next 2 years. Not technically an orphan, her mother was alive, merely institutionalized. The state of California classified children like Norma Jeane as wards, those whose parents could not or would not care for them. At the orphanage, she was assigned a number, 3463. For 2 years, she answered to that number more often than to her name. I wasn't a person anymore, she would tell interviewers decades later. I was a thing, a number on a list. The orphanage was a large brick building with dormitories, communal meals, and strict schedules. The children wore identical clothes, ate identical food, followed identical routines. Individuality was discouraged. Dreams were impractical. The staff was overworked, the facilities underfunded. Not a place of cruelty, but a place of erasure, where children learned that they were interchangeable, forgettable, worth exactly what the state paid for their upkeep. Norma Jeane learned to make herself useful. She scrubbed floors and washed dishes without complaint, smiled at the staff, and stayed out of trouble. But at night, in her narrow bed, she stared at the ceiling and made silent promises to herself. She would not stay here forever. She would become someone. She would have a white piano of her own someday, in a house that no one could take away. When she was 11, placement with a new family began, then another, then another. Grace McKee Goddard was a friend of Gladys's from the film laboratory. She had visited Norma Jeane at the orphanage, brought her small presents, expressed affection. When she offered to become the girl's legal guardian, it seemed like salvation. Grace had a husband named Irvin, whom everyone called Doc, and a modest home where Norma Jeane could finally belong. Grace was obsessed with Jean Harlow, the platinum blonde movie star who had died young and glamorous. She saw raw material in Norma Jeane, something that could be shaped and polished. Grace introduced the girl to makeup, to hair dye, to the transformative power of appearance. She taught her how to walk, how to smile, how to present herself as something better than what circumstances had made her. She looked at me and saw a project, the actress would later observe. Not a child, raw material to be molded. But Grace's household held darker secrets. Her husband Doc was a drinker with roaming eyes. The details of what happened in that house were never fully documented, but Norma Jeane would later allude to abuse during these years. She mentioned a man she called Mr. Kimmel, possibly a boarder, possibly a neighbor, who had assaulted her when she was 8 years old. Whether this happened in the Goddard home or elsewhere, the pattern was established. Adult men saw her not as a child to protect, but as a body to use. The stuttering worsened. The nightmares began. She developed obsessive habits, washing her face 15 times a day, checking locks repeatedly, starting at sudden sounds. Her body was becoming a source of danger, something that attracted unwanted attention and brought unwanted consequences. By 12, Norma Jeane had internalized a devastating formula. Love was conditional. Adults betrayed children. Her body was the only thing of value she possessed, and even that could be taken without her consent. The only way to survive was to become what others wanted to see, to transform herself into something desirable, controllable, safe. At 16, Grace Goddard presented her with 2 options. Grace's husband was being transferred to another state, and they could not take Norma Jeane with them. The girl could return to the orphanage and remain a ward of the state until she turned 18, or she could get married. She chose the stranger. His name was James Dougherty, 21 years old, a factory worker who lived nearby. He had a pleasant face and a steady job and no particular interest in a frightened teenage girl with a stutter. But Grace convinced him that marriage would be a kindness, and he agreed. On June 19, 1942, just 18 days after her 16th birthday, Norma Jeane Mortensen became Norma Jeane Dougherty. It was not a romance. It was survival mathematics. The wedding was small, the dress borrowed, the future uncertain. But for the first time since her mother's breakdown, she had somewhere to belong. She was sweet but scared, Dougherty wrote in his memoir published decades later. First night she cried, not from pain, from relief. She finally had somewhere to stay. The marriage was quiet and ordinary. He worked at Lockheed Aircraft. She kept house, cleaned obsessively, tried to learn how to cook. At night, she woke screaming from dreams she could not describe, clutching at shadows. Desperate for affection but confused by intimacy, craving closeness while fearing what it might cost. Then the war came. In 1943, James Dougherty enlisted in the Merchant Marines and shipped out to the Pacific. His young wife, barely 17, took a job at the radio plane munitions factory in Burbank. She inspected parachutes for $20 a week, standing at a conveyor belt alongside hundreds of other women, anonymous and invisible. The work was tedious, the hours were long, but for the first time in her life, Norma Jeane was earning her own money, making her own decisions, existing outside the control of foster parents and husbands. Still shy, still stuttered when nervous, still washed her face compulsively throughout the day. But something was changing inside her. Something was preparing to emerge. In the summer of 1944, an Army photographer named David Conover arrived at the factory. He was shooting propaganda images, women contributing to the war effort, and he needed photogenic subjects. His supervisor had mentioned a pretty girl who worked on the parachute line. Conover found her bent over her workstation, her hair tied back in a bandana, her face free of makeup. She looked up when he approached, and something happened. Later, he would struggle to describe it. The camera saw what his eyes almost missed, a quality of light and vulnerability and desire and innocence, all swirling together in a single face. "Miss," he said, "has anyone ever told you that you photograph well?" For the first time, she did not stutter. "I know," she said, "I've always known." The photographs from that session are unremarkable by later standards, a young woman in work clothes smiling at a camera, but they changed everything. Conover showed them to his contacts. Word spread. A modeling agency called, then another. Norma Jeane Dougherty discovered that the camera loved her in ways that people never had. In front of a lens, her stutter disappeared. Her self-consciousness evaporated. She became someone else, someone confident, someone desirable, someone worth looking at. The camera did not judge her past. The camera did not know about foster homes and institutions and abuse. The camera only saw what she showed it, and what she showed it was magnificent. Letters to her husband overseas revealed the split already beginning. Sometimes she signed them, "Your loving wife, Norma Jeane." Other times, N.J., the girl who's going to be somebody. Two people emerging, the dutiful wife waiting at home and the ambitious dreamer preparing to escape. James Dougherty came home from the war expecting to find the same frightened girl he had married. Instead, he found a stranger with bleached blonde hair, talking about modeling, about the dream factory, about becoming someone. She had already begun the transformation, and he could not stop it. The divorce was finalized in September of 1946. She kept nothing from the marriage, not his name, not his memories, not his promises of ordinary happiness. She had chosen a different path. Hollywood had given her a glimpse of fame. New York, she believed, might eventually give her legitimacy. But first, she had to conquer the studio system. A few months before the divorce, she had walked into the offices of 20th Century Fox for a screen test. Ben Lyon, a studio executive, watched her move silently in front of the camera, no dialogue, just presence. When the film came back from the laboratory, he called her into his office. "You don't just photograph well," he told her. "The camera makes love to you, and you make love right back." They needed a new name for her. Norma Jeane Mortensen, or Dougherty, or Baker, none of them sounded like a star. Lyon suggested Marilyn, after the Broadway actress Marilyn Miller. She needed a last name to match. She thought of her mother, locked away in an institution, lost to madness. She thought of the white piano, sold and gone forever. She thought of the family she had never really had. Monroe, she said, Marilyn Monroe. It was her mother's maiden name, a desperate grasp at identity, at connection to something real amid all the artifice she was creating. On that day in 1946, Norma Jeane legally became someone else. But the transformation was not complete. Over the following years, she remade her face through subtle surgeries, a slight refinement of the nose, a cartilage implant in the chin. The brown hair became perpetually platinum, a painful process of bleaching repeated every 3 weeks for the rest of her life. The breathy voice developed not as affectation but as technique to mask her childhood stutter. Speaking slowly forced others to lean in. Once they leaned in, she had them. Mirrors became her obsession, not from vanity but from uncertainty. Which face was real? Which woman was she? The frightened foster child or the emerging goddess? She began referring to Marilyn in the third person, as if discussing a character she played rather than a person she was. "I'm not her, you know," she told a photographer during these years. "She's something I invented, I just live inside her." The invention took time. Years of small roles and casting couches and promises made and broken. It took hunger, literal hunger, the kind that made her pose naked for a calendar because she needed $50 for rent. It took learning the rules of a system designed to use women like her and discard them when their usefulness ended. The studio system operated like a medieval guild. Young actresses were signed to 7-year contracts that gave studios total control over their images, their roles, their public statements, and often their bodies. The unwritten rules were understood by everyone and spoken by no one. She learned these rules quickly, in hotel rooms and executive offices, on casting couches and in private dining rooms. Years later, she would describe this education with brutal honesty. "Honey," she told a friend, "I've spent more time on my knees than all the nuns in Los Angeles combined." Joseph Schenck was one of her first teachers. 69 years old, one of the most influential executives at Fox, with a face like a melting candle and hands that trembled slightly when he reached for her. She was 21. He invited her to his mansion for dinner, and she understood what dinner meant. Joe Schenck smelled like mothballs and old money, she later recalled. Touching him was like holding a dead fish, but he never lied to me. That's more than most of them did. In exchange for her visits, Schenck made phone calls. He mentioned her name to directors. He ensured that her contract was renewed. It was a transaction and both parties understood the terms. Then came Johnny Hyde. He was different. Hyde was an influential agent at the William Morris Agency, a small man with a weak heart and an enormous capacity for love. He saw her at a party and became instantly, hopelessly devoted. He left his wife for her. He proposed marriage repeatedly. He used every ounce of his influence to advance her career, securing her small but crucial roles in 2 films that would change everything, The Asphalt Jungle and All About Eve. She refused to marry him. "I won't marry for money," she told friends. "That's the one line I won't cross." Hyde died of a heart attack in December of 1950, alone and heartbroken. His family banned her from the funeral. She stood outside the church in a black dress, weeping for the one man in the film industry who had loved her without wanting to own her. But during those difficult years, she had learned something crucial. They thought they were using her, those executives and agents and producers. They saw her as a body to enjoy and discard. They did not realize she was taking notes, studying them, learning what men wanted, learning how to become irreplaceable. Somewhere, allegedly, she kept a red diary filled with names and dates and acts, insurance for the future, or a time bomb waiting to explode. In March of 1952, that bomb nearly detonated. Her career was finally ascending. Several films behind her, each one building on the last. Magazine covers featured her face. The studio was preparing to launch her as a major star. Then someone discovered the nude calendar. In 1949, desperate for rent money, she had posed for a photographer named Tom Kelly. The photographs were artistic, tasteful by later standards. A woman reclining on red velvet, her body curved and soft. Kelly paid her $50. The calendar company made millions. And now those images had surfaced, threatening to destroy everything she had built. Studio executives panicked. In 1952, nude photographs meant scandal. Scandal meant career death. The standard response was denial, deny everything, threaten lawsuits, bury the evidence. She chose a different path. "Yes, it's me," she told the press. "I was hungry. I needed $50 for rent. Would you have preferred I starve?" A masterstroke. She transformed shame into sympathy, scandal into publicity. The calendar sold millions of copies. Her fame exploded rather than collapsed. She had discovered something valuable. Scandal, properly managed, was not a threat but a weapon. A young publisher named Hugh Hefner took note. He purchased the photographs and featured them in the first issue of a new magazine called Playboy. He never met her. He never paid her a cent beyond what Kelly had already given. Decades later, he would buy the burial vault next to hers, ensuring that even in death, she could not escape men who had profited from her image. The calendar taught her to play the game, but not everyone applauded her victory. One woman in particular watched her rise with narrowing eyes and sharpening tongue. Joan Crawford had been a star when the blonde newcomer was still in foster care. Crawford represented old Hollywood discipline, glamour, the studio system at its most controlled. And she despised this new creature who seemed to succeed through scandal rather than training. At the Photoplay Awards in February of 1954, their worlds collided. The rising star arrived in a gold lame dress so tight that she had been sewn into it. Every male eye in the room followed her. Every female eye narrowed. Crawford's response was immediate and public. She called the appearance a burlesque show and told reporters that such vulgar displays represented everything wrong with this industry. Privately, the younger woman was unimpressed. "Joan Crawford has been around since movies learned to talk," she told a friend. "Maybe longer, and she's angry at me for being young. Honey, that's her problem, not mine." Beneath the rivalry lay an uncomfortable truth. Crawford and the blonde bombshell had more in common than either would admit. Both came from poverty. Both were self-invented. Both were survivors of abuse who had transformed themselves through sheer will. They might have been allies. Instead, they became symbols of a generational war, old Hollywood against new, discipline against instinct, controlled glamour against dangerous sensuality. She had conquered the studio system. She had turned scandal into fame and fame into influence. But she wanted something that the Dream Factory could not give her: a real home, a real family, someone who saw Norma Jeane beneath the platinum surface. She found it, briefly, in the arms of a baseball legend, who would both save and nearly destroy her. Joe DiMaggio first saw her photograph in a newspaper. She was posing with two baseball players from the Chicago White Sox, smiling that smile that seemed to promise everything and nothing. A friend asked if he wanted to meet her. DiMaggio, who rarely showed interest in anything outside baseball, said yes. They met in March of 1952 at Villanova, an Italian restaurant on the Sunset Strip. He arrived expecting the empty-headed blonde from the photographs, giggly, vapid, easy to charm and easier to forget. He found something else entirely. She was late, of course. She would always be late. But when she finally appeared, something shifted in the room. It was not just her beauty, though that was remarkable. It was a quality of presence, of vulnerability wrapped in armor, of intelligence hiding behind carefully constructed foolishness. She made a joke about baseball that revealed she knew nothing about the sport. He laughed anyway. He didn't talk much, she told friends afterward. But when he looked at me, I felt safe, like nothing bad could touch me. Joseph Paul DiMaggio was the most celebrated athlete in America. The son of Italian fishermen from San Francisco, he had risen through talent and discipline to become the greatest center fielder of his generation. His 56-game hitting streak in 1941 remained unmatched. He had married once before, to an actress named Dorothy Arnold, and the marriage had ended badly. He hated the film industry, distrusted publicity, valued privacy above almost everything. She was the opposite of everything he had learned to avoid. She lived for cameras. She thrived on attention. Her career depended on the very public exposure he despised, and yet he could not stay away. Their courtship lasted 2 years. He pursued her with patience that surprised everyone who knew him. He was accustomed to winning quickly, to overpowering opponents through superior skill. But she kept him at a distance, saying yes to dinners and no to proposals, drawing him closer while maintaining escape routes. "Joe wants me to quit acting," she confided to friends. "He doesn't understand. Acting isn't what I do, it's who I am." They would go to movies together, she disguised in a headscarf and no makeup, he in a hat pulled low. Sometimes they walked on beaches at night, anonymous and free. She loved those moments, the possibility of being ordinary, of being loved for something other than the image she had created. "Nobody recognizes me without the face," she said once, delighted. But occasionally a sharp-eyed teenager would spot her, would approach hesitantly, would ask for an autograph. She always obliged, watching their faces light up with wonder. DiMaggio proposed multiple times. She refused, then wavered, then refused again. What she wanted and what he offered could not quite align. He dreamed of a wife at home, children in the yard, Sunday dinners with his family. She dreamed of artistic respect, of serious roles, of being seen as more than a body. In January of 1954, she finally said yes. Perhaps she was tired of fighting. Perhaps she genuinely believed they could make it work. Perhaps she simply wanted, for once, to belong to someone who wanted Norma Jeane rather than the goddess. The wedding took place on January 14th at San Francisco City Hall. A simple ceremony, no Hollywood guests, no publicity circus, just family and a few friends. She wore a brown suit instead of white, a choice that puzzled observers. He wore a blue suit and an expression of barely contained joy. They signed the papers, posed for photographs, and drove away as husband and wife. The marriage lasted 274 days. Trouble began almost immediately. They went to Japan for their honeymoon. DiMaggio had business interests there, and she was mobbed by fans at the airport. He stood aside, watching the chaos, his face darkening. He had married a woman. He had received a phenomenon. Then the army called. Would she consider entertaining American troops stationed in Korea? The war had ended, but thousands of soldiers remained. A visit from the world's most desired woman would boost morale enormously. She went. 10 shows in 4 days, standing on makeshift stages in freezing temperatures, wearing a purple sequin dress that offered no protection against the Korean winter. 100,000 soldiers cheered for her. She sang, she joked, she posed for photographs. She returned to Japan glowing with an excitement DiMaggio had never seen. "Joe, you never heard such cheering," she told him, still flushed with triumph. His response came cold as the Korean wind. "Yeah, I have." It was a small moment, but it contained everything that would destroy them. He had been the cheered one once. He had stood in Yankee Stadium while 60,000 fans screamed his name. Now he was the husband of the cheered one, standing in shadows, watching her receive what he had lost. His ego could not survive it. The possessiveness that followed was volcanic. He questioned her about every man she spoke with. He demanded to know her schedule, her co-stars, her intentions. When she worked late, he paced and drank and imagined betrayals. When she dressed for public appearances, he criticized the necklines, the hemlines, the way fabric clung to her body. "He wanted to protect me," she said later, "by locking me away from everything that made me who I am." The violence began subtly: a grabbed arm, a shove during arguments. Makeup artists noticed bruises that required extra concealment. Friends heard shouting through hotel walls. She confided to intimates about Joe's temper, about nights when furniture flew and doors slammed, and she cowered in corners waiting for the storm to pass. In November of 1954, DiMaggio and Frank Sinatra conducted what would become known as the Wrong Door Raid. Convinced that she was having an affair, they broke into an apartment where they believed she was meeting a lover. Wrong apartment. They terrorized an innocent woman named Florence Kotz, who sued them both. The incident was hushed up, but it revealed the depth of DiMaggio's obsession. Then came the skirt. September 15, 1954. New York City. They were filming a scene for the 7-Year Itch on Lexington Avenue, above a subway grate. Director Billy Wilder had conceived an image that would become immortal: the star standing over the grate, her white dress billowing upward as a train passed below, revealing her legs while she laughed and tried to push the fabric down. Word spread through the city. By 2 in the morning, thousands had gathered to watch. Photographers jostled for position. Men pressed against police barricades, necks craning for a glimpse. She stood on the grate, take after take, the dress rising and falling while the crowd roared its approval. DiMaggio watched from across the street. He saw his wife's body exposed to thousands of leering strangers. He saw her obvious pleasure in their attention, her delight in being desired by multitudes. He saw everything he hated about her world crystallized in a single, repeating image. That night at the St. Regis Hotel, neighbors heard screaming. They heard objects breaking against walls. They heard sounds they did not want to identify. 3 days later, she filed for divorce. The proceedings were brief and brutal. On October 27, 1954, their marriage officially ended. She cited mental cruelty as grounds. Genuine tears streamed down her face at the courthouse while photographers captured everyone. He said nothing to the press, his face a mask of controlled devastation. Joe was the only man who truly wanted Norma Jeane, she reflected years later. But he wanted to lock her in a box where no one else could see her, and I couldn't live in a box, not even for love. They remained connected, however. The divorce ended their marriage but not their bond. He would rescue her from an asylum years later. He would bury her when everyone else had abandoned her. He would send roses to her grave 3 times a week for 20 years. His final words, allegedly spoken on his deathbed in 1999, "I'll finally get to see Marilyn." But that is later. In the autumn of 1954, she was alone again, free of another cage but terrified of freedom. She had escaped her second husband. Now she needed to escape Hollywood itself. She ran to New York. In January of 1955, she did something unprecedented. She walked away from the most powerful movie studio in the world. Fox had assigned her to a film she considered beneath her talents, another empty blonde role, another exercise in jiggling and giggling. She refused to report. The studio suspended her contract. They expected her to capitulate within weeks. Instead, she boarded a plane for Manhattan. "Sue me," she reportedly told a Fox executive. "I'll still be famous when the lawsuit's over." New York in 1955 was a different world from the Dream Factory. Here, artists took themselves seriously. Here, intellectuals gathered in smoky apartments to discuss Dostoevsky and Freud. Here, the actor's studio taught a revolutionary approach called method acting, where performers accessed genuine emotion rather than manufactured gestures. She enrolled immediately. Lee Strasberg was the studio's founder and high priest. A small, intense man with penetrating eyes, he had trained some of the finest actors of the generation, Marlon Brando, James Dean, Montgomery Clift. His wife Paula would later become an influential presence on film sets, coaching actors between takes. When the blonde actress walked into his classroom, Strasberg expected the Hollywood creation, beautiful, empty, teachable at best. What he found astonished him. "She is one of the two most talented people I have ever taught," he told colleagues. The other was Brando. "She has an instinct for emotional truth that cannot be learned. It can only be freed." She threw herself into the work with desperate intensity. Every class attended, copious notes taken, exercises performed that required accessing her deepest wounds. The method demanded that actors use their own experiences, their own pain, to fuel their performances. For Norma Jeane, this meant reopening every scar, the abandonment, the abuse, the madness in her blood. It was brilliant technique. It was also destruction disguised as art. But the transformation extended beyond the classroom. She began moving in intellectual circles that would have been unimaginable in Hollywood. She befriended Carson McCullers, the Southern novelist whose work explored loneliness and otherness. She spent evenings with Truman Capote, exchanging gossip and observations about human nature. She discussed literature with Tennessee Williams, debating interpretations of Chekhov. She read everything, one friend recalled. Dostoevsky, Rilke, Joyce. She carried a biography of Lincoln everywhere she went. She wasn't the empty blonde. She never had been. That was just the costume. Her personal library eventually contained over 400 books. Notes from Strasberg's classes reveal sophisticated understanding of character psychology, dramatic structure, and the philosophy of performance. The woman who played vapid showgirls was, in private, one of the most intellectually curious people in any room she entered. She used this period to launch her rebellion against the studio system. With photographer Milton Green, she formed Marilyn Monroe Productions. One of the first times a female star had demanded creative control over her own career. Revolutionary and terrifying to the executives who had built their fortunes on owning talent. Fox eventually capitulated. They offered a new contract with terms that would have been unthinkable months earlier. Director approval, cinematographer approval, a dramatic increase in salary. She had beaten them. She had proven that stars could fight back and win. But the studio never forgave her. In the years to come, they would sabotage productions, leak unflattering stories, undermine her at every opportunity. She had won the battle. The war was just beginning. And then, in the wreckage of everything she had lost, two things happened. She found a man who seemed to offer everything she had ever wanted, and she began a slow collapse that would eventually consume her entirely. Arthur Miller had written words that made America weep. Death of a salesman had broken hearts across the nation. The crucible had challenged a country's conscience. And now, this giant of American letters was falling in love with a woman the world considered a joke. He was tall, intellectual, serious, everything the Dream Factory was not. When she met him, she felt she had finally found someone who could see past the blonde surface to the woman beneath. Their courtship was complicated by his existing marriage, his two children, and the political dangers that surrounded him. Miller had been called before the House Un-American Activities Committee, accused of communist sympathies. Association with him could damage her career irreparably. She didn't care. When reporters asked about their relationship, she confirmed it publicly, aligning herself with a man the government considered suspect. When the committee demanded that Miller explain why he needed a passport to travel to England, he gave an answer that made headlines worldwide. "To be with the woman who will be my wife," he told them. It was the most romantic thing anyone had ever said about her in public. She had never felt more loved. They married on June 29, 1956, in two ceremonies, civil and Jewish. She had converted to Judaism for him, embracing a new religion as she had embraced new names and new faces throughout her life. The conversion represented hope, a new identity, a new beginning, a chance to become someone legitimate, someone serious, someone worthy of respect. Before the wedding, she found his notebook. Miller kept journals as writers do. She found one in his study and could not resist reading it. What she discovered devastated her. He had written that she was disappointing. He had called her a whore. He had expressed doubt about their relationship, questioning whether he had made a mistake in leaving his wife for this glittering, damaged creature. She never told him she had read it. She married him anyway. She never forgot. The marriage began with promise and deteriorated into mutual disappointment. She wanted him to validate Norma Jeane, to see and love the intelligent, serious woman beneath the performance. He wanted her to inspire his work, to be his muse, to fulfill some fantasy of artistic partnership. Neither got what they wanted. She became pregnant in 1957. For a few weeks, she allowed herself to imagine a future that included children, the family she had never had, the mother she had never been able to become. Then her body betrayed her. An ectopic pregnancy, a pregnancy outside the womb, required emergency surgery. She nearly died. The child was lost. After the second loss in 1958, nurses found her at 3 in the morning, standing barefoot in the hospital corridor, whispering to a child that would never exist. The doctors explained it clinically: endometriosis, a painful condition that made pregnancy difficult and often impossible. Her body, which had been her primary currency, had failed her in the one way that mattered most. "I can't even do this right," she told her psychiatrist after one loss. "I can't even be a mother." Each miscarriage confirmed her deepest fears. She could not carry a child, could not create life, could not become the mother who would redeem all the absent mothers of her own childhood. The dream of family died in hospital rooms and recovery wards, one loss at a time. The pills accelerated: Nembutal to sleep, amphetamines to wake, champagne to smooth the edges between. The cycle that would eventually kill her was now firmly entrenched, each pill a small surrender, each morning a resurrection that grew harder to achieve. Miller watched her unravel and took notes. That was what writers did, after all. They observed, they recorded, they transformed private pain into public art. He was writing a screenplay meant as a gift for her, a serious dramatic role that would finally prove her talent to the world. He called it The Misfits. She would play Roslyn, a damaged divorcee in the Nevada desert, surrounded by broken men who could not save her or themselves. When she finally read the script, she recognized every wound. But that film was still ahead. First, there was another production to survive, a comedy that would push her to the absolute edge of her capabilities and beyond. She had escaped the orphanage, survived Hollywood, and conquered the studio system. She had married a legend and divorced him, married an intellectual, and watched that union crumble too. But her greatest performance was about to begin, and her greatest catastrophe was waiting just beyond the spotlight. Some Like It Hot began filming in 1958, and nothing about it was easy. Director Billy Wilder had worked with difficult actresses before. He had not worked with this one. She arrived late every day, not by minutes but by hours. Simple dialogue defeated her. The line "It's me, sugar" required 47 takes before Wilder got something usable. Her acting coach Paula Strasberg whispered contradictory directions between takes, infuriating the director. The crew grew exhausted. Tony Curtis, her co-star, later claimed that kissing her was like kissing Hitler. Wilder told reporters his doctor had advised him to stop making pictures with her entirely. But watch the finished film. Watch her sing "I Want to Be Loved by You." Watch the way she makes you laugh and breaks your heart simultaneously. Watch the emotional truth she brings to a comic role, the vulnerability beneath the jokes, the desperate hunger for love that no amount of male attention can satisfy. She was impossible, Wilder admitted years later. She was also magic, complete magic. I'd work with her again tomorrow. During filming, she discovered she was pregnant. The stress and medication were too much. She miscarried weeks later. She never told the production. She finished the film in physical and emotional agony, delivering a performance that appears effortless because she made certain no one could see the cost. That was her gift. That was her curse. She could not access one without the other. Some Like It Hot premiered to massive success. Critics praised her comic timing. Audiences loved her. The film would be remembered as one of the greatest comedies ever made. She had proven once again that she could deliver brilliance despite, or perhaps because of, chaos. But she was running out of reserves. The next film would drain whatever remained. Before The Misfits began, there was Yves Montand. She met him during the filming of Let's Make Love in 1959. Montand was a French actor, handsome and charming, married to the acclaimed actress Simone Signoret. Miller was away much of the time, working on the Misfits screenplay, leaving his wife alone with her co-star for long hours of rehearsal and filming. The affair was almost inevitable. She fell into it with the desperation of a woman who needed constant proof that she was desirable. Montand provided that proof enthusiastically, repeatedly, without apparent guilt about his own marriage. She convinced herself that he loved her, that he would leave Signoret, that this was the real thing at last. He had no such intentions. When filming ended, Montand returned to his wife without hesitation. He gave interviews describing the affair as a pleasant distraction, nothing more. He made clear that she had meant nothing beyond the immediate pleasures of their time together. The humiliation was public and complete. Newspapers that had breathlessly covered the affair now gleefully reported its end. Signoret, maintaining her dignity, offered a comment that wounded more than any insult could. "If Marilyn is in love with my husband, it proves she has good taste." Miller knew about the affair. He said nothing. The marriage was already dead. She was seeking from strangers what her husband no longer provided: attention, desire, proof that she existed. The intellectual partnership she had imagined had become two people sharing space while living in separate worlds. When she finally read the Misfits screenplay in its completed form, she understood how separate those worlds had become. Rosalind, the character Miller had written for her, was a woman falling apart. Recently divorced, emotionally fragile, unable to connect meaningfully with the broken men who surrounded her. Beautiful and damaged and doomed. "He used me," she told a friend after reading it. "Every breakdown, every fear, every secret I told him in the dark, he put it all in the script. He turned my pain into his art." Filming began in the summer of 1960, in the Nevada desert, in temperatures exceeding 100 degrees. John Huston directed. Clark Gable, the biggest star of the Dream Factory's golden age, would be her co-star. And Arthur Miller would be there every day, watching his wife perform a role he had written from the wreckage of their marriage. The production was catastrophic. She was hospitalized during filming for what the studio called exhaustion. The truth: overdose and nervous collapse. Production halted. Insurance was invoked. When she returned, she and Miller barely spoke off-camera. Watch the film today and you can see a marriage ending in real time. The scenes between them crackle with hostility that no script could have created. They are not acting. They are dismantling. Clark Gable treated her with patience and kindness that no one else on set could muster. The king of Hollywood was 60 years old and feeling every one of them. The Nevada heat punished his aging body. The production delays tested his professionalism, but he never lost patience with his troubled co-star. She had idolized him since childhood. He represented the fantasy father she had never known, the strong and gentle man who would protect her from the world. Between takes, he told her stories about the early days of film. He treated her with the gentle respect of an old-fashioned gentleman who understood that some women needed kindness more than criticism. "Clark understood me," she said later. "He never yelled. He never made me feel stupid. He looked at me like I was worth waiting for." He died of a heart attack on November 16, 1960, 12 days after filming Wrapped. She collapsed when she heard the news. For 3 days, she refused to leave her bed, refused food, refused comfort. His widow Kay blamed the stress of working with her, the months of delays, the hours of waiting in scorching heat, the physical and emotional strain of accommodating a co-star who could not accommodate herself. The accusation was not entirely fair. Gable had been a heavy smoker and drinker with a history of heart problems, but she accepted the blame as if it were verdict rather than opinion. "I killed him," she said at his funeral, which she attended secretly, weeping in a back pew. "I killed the only man who was ever gentle with me." The final divorce from Miller was finalized in January of 1961. They had been married less than 5 years. The intellectual partnership she had craved, the legitimacy she had sought, the proof that she was more than a body, all of it had collapsed into mutual recrimination and legal documents. She was 34 years old, 3 times married, 3 times divorced, childless despite desperate wanting, running out of time and places to hide. Then they locked her in an asylum, and her worst nightmare came true. In February of 1961, on the advice of her psychiatrist, she checked herself into the Payne Whitney Psychiatric Clinic in New York City. She expected a quiet rest facility, private rooms, attentive staff, a place to recover from the wreckage of her marriage and the exhaustion of filming. She expected the discreet care that celebrities received when they needed to disappear for a while. What she found was a locked psychiatric ward. Her clothes were taken, a hospital gown given, a room with barred windows and a reinforced door became her world. The walls were padded in some sections. Other patients screamed through the night. Staff observed her through a small window, making notes on clipboards, treating her not as a celebrity seeking rest but as a mental patient requiring supervision. She had become her mother. This was the nightmare that had haunted her since childhood. Her grandmother Della, dead in an asylum. Her grandfather Otis, dead in an asylum. Her uncle Marion, dead in an asylum. Her mother Gladys, still alive but lost forever behind institutional walls. The genetic curse that she had spent her entire life fleeing had finally caught her. She screamed. She demanded release. She threatened suicide if they did not let her out. When words failed, she picked up a chair and smashed a window, cutting her hands on the glass. The staff sedated her and made notes about her violent tendencies. Somehow, she managed to smuggle out a letter. Joe DiMaggio was in Florida when the message reached him. He had not seen her in months. Their marriage had ended 7 years earlier. He had watched from a distance as she married Miller, as that marriage too collapsed, as she spiraled deeper into dependency and despair. He had never stopped loving her. He had simply learned to love her from afar. He flew to New York immediately. What happened at Payne Whitney when DiMaggio arrived has become legend. He reportedly threatened to tear the hospital apart brick by brick unless they released her. He demanded to speak to administrators, to doctors, to anyone with authority. He made clear that he would involve lawyers, newspapers, the full weight of his fame and fury unless they let her go. They released her into his care. He took her to Florida, to a quiet place away from cameras and studios and all the machinery that had been grinding her down. He asked nothing of her. He made no demands. He simply provided what he had always wanted to give her: protection. Joe was the only one who came, she said later, the only one. The Payne Whitney episode crystallized something in her mind. She had glimpsed the abyss that awaited if she could not hold herself together. She had seen the future that her blood demanded: locked rooms, barred windows, death by institutional neglect. The choice before her was stark: fight to stay sane or surrender to the madness that had claimed everyone else in her family. She chose to fight, but her weapons were failing. The pills that had helped her sleep now trapped her in cycles of dependency. The alcohol that had smoothed her anxieties now amplified them. The fame that had seemed like salvation now felt like a prison of expectations she could never meet. And in Washington, men of influence were beginning to see her as something new, an opportunity, a conquest, and eventually a threat. The Kennedys did not find her. They collected her, the way they collected everything beautiful and potentially useful. Peter Lawford was the connection. An English actor who had married Patricia Kennedy, he served as the family's Hollywood liaison, facilitating introductions between the Kennedy brothers and the stars who glittered at his Santa Monica beach house parties. She had met John Kennedy briefly in the late 1950s, but their real connection began in 1961. By then, he was President of the United States, the youngest man ever elected to that office, handsome and charismatic, married to the elegant Jacqueline and father to 2 young children. He was also a voracious collector of women. Kennedy's appetite for extramarital affairs was legendary within circles that protected such secrets. He had conducted liaisons with socialites and actresses, with secretaries and interns, and with at least one woman connected to organized crime. He treated these encounters as conquests, trophies to be acquired and discarded without emotional attachment. She became the ultimate trophy. Their affair began sometime in 1961, though the exact timeline remains disputed. What is certain is that the most celebrated woman in America began a sexual relationship with the most powerful man in the world. Secret Service agents were instructed to lose her when she visited. Her name never appeared in official White House logs. She was smuggled through back entrances, hidden in private quarters, erased from any record that might later prove inconvenient. But people noticed, people always notice. The FBI took particular interest. Edgar Hoover had despised the Kennedy family for years. He had compiled files on Joseph Kennedy's business dealings, on John's wartime service, on Robert's aggressive prosecution of organized crime. Adding evidence of the president's affair with the world's most famous actress was simply another weapon in his arsenal. Hoover waited, watching, accumulating leverage he might someday need. She, meanwhile, began to believe that the affair was something more than recreation for a powerful man. She had always confused intimacy with love, had always believed that physical closeness implied emotional commitment. Kennedy, she told friends, was different from the others. Kennedy understood her. Kennedy might actually leave his wife. He promised, she reportedly said, he promised things would change. But Kennedy promised many women many things. His marriage to Jackie was political as much as personal, a union that neither party intended to dissolve regardless of whatever private arrangements they maintained. The blonde actress was a pleasure, not a prospect. The sooner she understood that, the better for everyone. She did not understand it, and what she knew or thought she knew made her dangerous. During their time together, Kennedy apparently spoke freely about matters that should have remained secret. According to later accounts, their conversations included discussions of Cuba, the CIA, and the administration's complicated relationship with organized crime. He seems to have trusted that a woman so focused on her own concerns would not pay attention to geopolitical details. He was wrong. She paid attention, she remembered, and allegedly she took notes. The Red Diary became the stuff of legend. Multiple sources confirmed that she kept some kind of record, dates, conversations, intimate details about her relationship with the president. Whether this diary was insurance, leverage, or simply the habit of a woman who processed her experiences through writing, its existence made her a threat to those who held authority. Then she did something that transformed her from inconvenient to intolerable. May 19, 1962, Madison Square Garden, New York City, a Democratic fundraiser celebrating President Kennedy's 45th birthday. 15,000 people in attendance, television cameras broadcasting to millions more. Peter Lawford introduced her with knowing amusement. Mr. President, the late Marilyn Monroe. A joke about her chronic lateness, it would become an epitaph. She appeared from the wings wearing a dress that made the audience gasp. Designed by Jean Louis, it had cost $12,000, an enormous sum in 1962. The fabric was flesh-colored, covered in rhinestones, so tight that she had been literally sewn into it. She appeared from any distance to be naked and glittering. She could barely walk in the dress. She could barely breathe. She was carried to the stage, positioned before the microphone, and left to perform. What followed was the most famous birthday greeting in history. "Happy birthday, Mr. President." Each word dripped with suggestion. Each pause promised intimacy. Her voice, always breathy, became something closer to pure seduction. 15,000 people witnessed her publicly declaring what everyone suspected and no one could prove. She was sleeping with the President of the United States. Kennedy handled the moment with practiced ease, joking that he could now retire from politics after such a sweet, wholesome tribute. The audience laughed, but backstage the atmosphere was very different. The Kennedy family was furious. Patricia Lawford blanched. Robert Kennedy, the Attorney General, watched with barely concealed alarm. Jackie, who had pointedly refused to attend, would later receive full reports of her husband's mistress performing her availability for a national audience. This was not how the game was played. Mistresses were secret. Affairs were denied. The compact that allowed powerful men their pleasures depended entirely on discretion, on the understanding that public acknowledgement meant public scandal. She had shattered the compact. Within days, Kennedy cut off contact. His phone number changed. Her calls went unanswered. The man who had promised her disappeared as completely as if she had dreamed him. She did not accept the rejection quietly. She began calling the White House directly. She called numbers she was not supposed to have. She demanded to speak with the president, with his staff, with anyone who could explain why she had been abandoned. Her behavior alarmed everyone connected to the administration. A woman scorned was dangerous enough. A renowned woman scorned, with knowledge of sensitive matters, was catastrophic. Something had to be done. They sent Robert Kennedy to manage the situation. Bobby, as the family called him, was different from his brother. Where Jack was charming and careless, Bobby was intense and moralistic, deeply Catholic, devoted to his wife Ethel and their growing brood of children. He was the administration's conscience, the one who prosecuted organized crime and championed civil rights, while his brother calculated political costs. Exactly what happened between Bobby Kennedy and the actress remains disputed decades later. Some accounts insist they had a full affair, as passionate and reckless as her involvement with Jack. Others claim Bobby was sent merely to quiet her, to explain why the relationship had to end, to ensure her discretion. What is certain is that they spent time together. Phone records show repeated calls between them. Witnesses placed them at private dinners, in quiet corners at parties, alone in her Brentwood home. Whether their relationship was romantic or managerial, it existed, and it ended as badly as the first. By the summer of 1962, she believed Bobby would leave his wife for her. She told friends that he had made promises, that they would be together, that this time was different. "He loves me," she insisted. "Not like Jack, Bobby really loves me." Bobby Kennedy had 7 children and unshakable political ambitions. He was not going to abandon his family for an actress whose stability was visibly collapsing. Whatever he had told her, whatever she had convinced herself he meant, divorce and remarriage were never possibilities he entertained. When he too began distancing himself, she responded with escalating desperation. She called the Justice Department. She left messages with secretaries. She threatened to hold a press conference and tell everything she knew about Jack, about Bobby, about Cuba and the CIA, and matters that could destroy the administration. "I'm tired of being treated like a piece of meat," she reportedly told Peter Lawford. "I'm going to tell everything." She had become a liability to the most powerful family in America, but she was also a liability to others. Sam Giancana had helped deliver Illinois to Kennedy in the 1960 election. The Chicago mob boss had expected, in return, protection from federal prosecution. Instead, Bobby Kennedy had launched the most aggressive anti-organized crime campaign in American history. Giancana felt betrayed, used, discarded. And Giancana knew the troubled actress. He knew her through Frank Sinatra, whose connections to organized crime were well documented. He had allegedly been at that dinner where the mysterious photograph was taken, the photograph with her, with Kennedy, with documents that could expose everything. She had information dangerous to both the president and his enemies. She had threatened to reveal it, and she was mentally unstable, chemically dependent, increasingly unpredictable. In the final weeks of her life, she was a woman who knew too much, trusted by no one, abandoned by everyone who had claimed to love her. Multiple parties had excellent reasons to want her silent. July brought a brief respite. Fox, which had fired her from Something's Got to Give in June, reversed course. They offered a new contract with better terms. She had won again, or seemed to. The production would resume. Her career would continue. Perhaps things were finally turning around. She did a photo shoot for Vogue in late July. The photographs show a woman who appears radiant, healthy, full of life. Her skin glows. Her smile reaches her eyes. Looking at these images, you would never guess that she had weeks to live. On August 1st, she celebrated. On August 3rd, she met with her psychiatrist, Ralph Greenson, and seemed anxious but not despairing. On August 4th, she spent the day at home in her Brentwood bungalow, making phone calls, receiving visitors, going through the ordinary motions of an ordinary Saturday. Her final phone call was to Peter Lawford. She sounded drugged, he later said, slurred, disconnected. She said something that he would remember for the rest of his life. Say goodbye to the president. Say goodbye to yourself because you're a nice guy. Lawford did not call the police. He did not drive to her house. He did not check on a woman who had just delivered what sounded like a farewell. No one did. At 3:30 in the morning on August 5, 1962, her housekeeper Eunice Murray called Dr. Greenson. The bedroom door was locked, she said. She could not rouse her employer. They broke down the door. She lay face down on the bed, naked, a telephone clutched in her hand. Empty pill bottles lined the nightstand. There was no note. There was no vomit, though a lethal oral overdose would typically produce it. There was no water glass to wash down the 40-plus pills that would have been required to kill her. She was 36 years old. She was the most celebrated woman in the world. She was dead. And within hours, the questions began, questions that would never receive satisfactory answers. The official timeline of that night has never made sense. Eunice Murray, the housekeeper, initially told police that she discovered something wrong around midnight. She saw light under the bedroom door, she said, and became concerned when her employer did not respond to knocking. Yet she waited until 3:30 in the morning to call Dr. Greenson. What happened during those 3.5 hours has never been satisfactorily explained. Later, Murray changed her story. She had not noticed the light until 3:30, she claimed. The midnight detail was a mistake, a confusion caused by shock and grief. But investigators noted that the thick carpet in the house would have made it impossible to see light under any door. The detail she first provided, then retracted, suggested she had been looking through the door rather than at it. Dr. Greenson arrived at the house and broke a window to enter the locked bedroom. He found his patient dead, her body already showing signs of rigor mortis. The police were called at 4:25 in the morning, nearly an hour after Greenson's arrival. What happened during that hour also remains unexplained. The first officers on the scene noted that the house appeared staged. Eunice Murray was doing laundry at 4 in the morning, An odd choice for a woman who had just discovered her employer's corpse. Papers had been burned in the fireplace. The filing cabinet in the guest cottage stood open, clearly rifled through. Evidence was missing, or had been removed. The bedroom itself presented contradictions. Empty bottles of Nembutal and chloral hydrate lined the nightstand, suggesting a massive oral overdose. But the autopsy would reveal no pill residue in her stomach or digestive tract. To end her life with pills, she would have needed to swallow more than 40 capsules. The human body cannot absorb that many capsules without leaving traces. There should have been undigested medication, partially dissolved pills, something to indicate how the drugs had entered her system. There was nothing. The coroner, Dr. Thomas Noguchi, noted this anomaly. He observed that the evidence was more consistent with an injected overdose or drugs administered by other means than with oral ingestion. He recommended further investigation. His superiors declined. The case was ruled probable suicide, and the inquiry was closed. But Noguchi never forgot. Years later, he would write that the case should have been investigated as a potential homicide. By then, the original tissue samples had been destroyed, the phone records had vanished, and most of the witnesses had developed convenient amnesia. Bobby Kennedy's whereabouts on August 4th remained disputed. He was officially in San Francisco that weekend, staying at a ranch south of the city. Multiple witnesses, however, placed him in Los Angeles. A helicopter pilot later claimed he had flown the Attorney General to the city that afternoon. Neighbors reported seeing a man matching Kennedy's description at the Brentwood home. Peter Lawford allegedly told friends that Bobby had visited that day for a final, ugly confrontation. The confrontation, according to some accounts, concerned her threats to go public. She had called the Justice Department repeatedly. She had spoken of a press conference. She possessed information, in her memory, in her diary, in whatever records she had kept that could destroy the administration. Bobby came to retrieve that information, these accounts suggest, and to make absolutely clear that the relationship was over. What happened next depends on who is telling the story. In some versions, Bobby left and she ended her life in despair. In others, he was still there when she died, departing only after ensuring that the scene would tell the story of suicide. In still others, neither Kennedy brother was involved in her death, but both were involved in the cover-up that followed, the hasty removal of evidence, the silencing of witnesses, the coordination of stories that would protect the presidency. The mob had its own interests in the outcome. Sam Giancana had resources that the Kennedys could not match: surveillance capabilities, contacts within local police, the ability to make problems disappear. If Giancana had wanted to embarrass the administration by exposing Kennedy's affair, keeping her alive would have been valuable. If he had wanted to create leverage, ensuring her permanent silence might have been more useful. Frank Sinatra's Calneva Lodge enters the narrative here. Weeks before her death, she had stayed at the Lake Tahoe resort, which Sinatra co-owned with Giancana. Witnesses reported seeing her incapacitated, surrounded by men whose identities were never confirmed. Photographs were allegedly taken during this visit, photographs that could have been used for blackmail or destruction. The mysterious photograph mentioned at the beginning of this narrative, the one allegedly showing her between Kennedy and Giancana, may have originated from this period or from an earlier encounter. Its existence has never been proven, but too many people have claimed to have seen it for the claims to be dismissed entirely. If it existed, it represented a threat to everyone involved. Its disappearance, along with her red diary and so much other evidence, suggests coordinated action by parties who rarely coordinated anything. The diary, if it existed, has never been found. Some say Bobby Kennedy took it that final night. Others claim it remains in a vault somewhere, waiting. The questions it might have answered will likely remain unanswered forever. J. Edgar Hoover certainly had interest in the matter. The FBI director had compiled files on the Kennedy family for years, evidence of a presidential affair with a woman who had mob connections, who had been photographed with organized crime figures, who had threatened to expose everything. Such evidence would have given Hoover enormous leverage over an administration he despised. Some researchers believe Hoover orchestrated the cover-up not to protect the Kennedys, but to protect his leverage over them. A solved murder would have been a scandal, but a contained scandal, investigated, resolved, finished. An unsolved death, shrouded in conspiracy theories, kept everyone vulnerable. The Kennedys would always know that Hoover knew. That knowledge was more valuable than any prosecution. The theories multiplied in the years that followed. The first theory, suicide, she had attempted before. She was depressed, abandoned, addicted. The simplest explanation often proves correct, but friends said she seemed better in her final days. She had plans. She had appointments scheduled for the following week. People planning to end their lives rarely make appointments they know they will not keep. The second theory, accidental overdose. She took pills to sleep, forgot she had taken them, took more. The haze of medication erasing memory, the desperate need for rest overwhelming caution, common among those trapped in cycles of dependency. But this does not explain the missing evidence, the changed stories, the obvious staging of the scene. The third theory, the Kennedys silenced her. She knew too much. She threatened exposure. They could not allow it. The administration, or agents acting on its behalf, ensured her permanent silence. But no definitive proof has ever emerged. The circumstantial evidence is troubling but not conclusive. The fourth theory, the mob eliminated her. Giancana wanted to embarrass the Kennedys, to demonstrate that their secrets were not safe, to create chaos that might benefit his interests. Or perhaps she had become inconvenient to the wrong people, and removing her served purposes we cannot fully understand. But why would the mob silence their own leverage? The fifth theory, Hoover's agents acted. The FBI director hated the Kennedys and saw an opportunity to create permanent vulnerability. Her death gave him power over them that would last as long as questions remained unanswered. But this remains largely speculative, supported more by Hoover's character than by evidence. Each theory has adherents. None has been proven conclusively. The evidence that would resolve the question, the tissue samples, the phone records, the diary, the photographs, has vanished as completely as if it never existed. What remains is a body of contradictions that cannot be reconciled. Her funeral was held on August 8, 1962, at Westwood Village Memorial Park. Joe DiMaggio took control of the arrangements with the same fierce protectiveness he had shown throughout their complicated relationship. He banned the Kennedys. He banned Frank Sinatra and the entire social circle that had surrounded her in those final years. He banned almost everyone from the film industry, the world he believed had destroyed her. Only 31 people were permitted to attend, a small gathering for the most renowned woman in the world. If it wasn't for those people, DiMaggio reportedly said, she'd still be alive. Lee Strasberg delivered the eulogy, speaking of her talent and vulnerability, her search for love and meaning, her gifts that the world had both celebrated and exploited. He did not mention that he would inherit the bulk of her estate, that her trust in him would make him wealthy from her image for decades to come. DiMaggio approached the open casket. He bent down and kissed her forehead. "I love you," he said. "I love you, I love you." He arranged for fresh red roses to be delivered to her crypt 3 times a week. He continued this ritual for 20 years until 1982. He never remarried. He rarely spoke of her publicly. When he died in 1999, his reported final words were, "I'll finally get to see Marilyn." Whatever their marriage had been, whatever violence and possessiveness had poisoned it, DiMaggio's devotion outlasted everyone else's. The men who had used her for pleasure, for profit, for political purposes, they moved on, protected their secrets, lived their lives. The man who had loved her too intensely to let her be herself remained faithful to her memory until his last breath. The others fared according to their natures. Arthur Miller remarried in 1962, just months after their divorce was finalized. His new wife, Ng Morath, was a photographer he had met on the set of The Misfits. They remained married until her death in 2002. Miller rarely spoke of his famous second wife in his later years. He died in 2005, having outlived her by 43 years. The Kennedys continued their trajectory of power and catastrophe. John was assassinated in Dallas on November 22, 1963, barely 15 months after she died. Bobby was assassinated in Los Angeles on June 6, 1968, while campaigning for the presidency. Whether either brother ever spoke privately about her, whether they carried guilt or merely inconvenience, died with them. Peter Lawford, the man who had introduced her to the Kennedy world and received her final phone call, descended into alcoholism and obscurity. He was quietly expelled from the Kennedy orbit after the assassination, blamed by some family members for his role in the scandals that had plagued Jack's presidency. He died in 1984, his liver destroyed, his fortune gone. He had known something about her final hours. He took that knowledge to his grave. Frank Sinatra continued performing and recording for decades, his reputation undimmed by whatever he knew or had participated in. The Cal Neva Lodge eventually closed. Sinatra sold his interest after losing his gaming license due to his associations with Sam Giancana. He died in 1998, wealthy and celebrated. Giancana himself was murdered in 1975, shot 7 times in his Oak Park, Illinois home just days before he was scheduled to testify before a Senate committee investigating CIA plots against foreign leaders. Whatever he knew about her death, whatever role he or his organization might have played, was silenced permanently. J. Edgar Hoover died in 1972, still serving as FBI director, still holding files that had given him influence over presidents and celebrities alike. His personal files were destroyed after his death, reportedly by his longtime companion Clyde Tolson. Whatever documentation existed about her surveillance, her relationships, her final days, whatever leverage Hoover had accumulated, vanished into the same void that swallowed so much evidence from that era. Eunice Murray, the housekeeper whose shifting testimony raised so many questions, lived until 1994. In her final years, she gave interviews that alternately confirmed and contradicted the official story. She suggested that Bobby Kennedy had visited the house that final night. She implied that she knew more than she had told police. Then she would retract, clarify, muddy the waters further. She died without ever providing a definitive account. Dr. Ralph Greenson, the psychiatrist who had treated her during her final years and who had broken down her bedroom door, was haunted by her death for the rest of his life. He wrote about her in clinical papers, analyzed their therapeutic relationship, defended his treatment decisions against critics who questioned his methods. He never forgave himself for failing to save her. He died in 1979. Gladys, the mother who had been institutionalized for most of her daughter's life, outlived her famous child by 22 years. She died in 1984 in a Florida nursing home, having never fully comprehended what Norma Jeane had become. The madness that had claimed her never lifted. The estate she left behind became a battlefield of its own. Her will directed that 75% of her residual estate go to Lee Strasberg, with smaller amounts designated for her mother's care and for her half-sister. She had trusted Strasberg as a teacher and father figure. She believed he would protect her artistic legacy. Strasberg's second wife, Anna, inherited everything when Lee died in 1982. Anna Strasberg had never met the woman whose image she now controlled. She had married Lee years after his famous student's death. Yet through the accident of matrimony and mortality, Anna gained control of one of the most valuable celebrity estates in history. The licensing began immediately and has never stopped. Her face sells perfume and handbags and alcohol. Her image appears on merchandise worldwide. In recent years, her likeness has been licensed for digital resurrection, her face and voice recreated by computers for new advertisements. The woman who was exploited in life continues to be exploited in death. The pattern that began with her body being traded for career advancement continues with her image being traded for corporate profit. She cannot consent. She cannot object. She cannot escape. Hugh Hefner ensured she would never escape him either. The Playboy founder, who had used her nude photographs to launch his empire without ever meeting her or paying her, purchased the burial vault next to hers. When he died in 2017, he was interred beside her, an eternal neighbor she never chose, a final proximity she could not prevent. The investigations reopened periodically, each time promising revelations that never quite materialized. In 1982, the Los Angeles District Attorney reviewed the case following publication of a biography that alleged murder. The review found factual discrepancies in the original investigation, but concluded there was insufficient evidence to support homicide charges. Files were sealed. The matter was closed again. In 1985, a BBC documentary presented new witnesses and new evidence suggesting foul play. The Los Angeles Police Department declined to reopen the investigation. In 2006, additional FBI documents were released under the Freedom of Information Act. They confirmed extensive surveillance of her activities and her connections to both Kennedy brothers. They raised more questions than they answered. In 2024, files from private investigator Fred Odash surfaced, allegedly containing recordings of her conversations and encounters with both Kennedys. Odash had worked for various clients with interests in the matter, newspapers seeking scandal, studios seeking leverage, possibly intelligence agencies seeking information. His files, if genuine, would represent explosive evidence. Their authenticity remains disputed. Each generation rediscovers her, reinvestigates her death, projects its own anxieties onto her story. She has become a mirror in which America sees its obsessions: celebrity worship, the treatment of women, government conspiracy, the destruction of those who become too visible. The questions never receive final answers because the people who could provide answers are dead, and the documents that could confirm truth are destroyed or hidden. The mysterious photograph from that October dinner has never surfaced. Perhaps it was destroyed. Perhaps it waits in some forgotten safe, in some archive that has not yet been opened. The questions remain, as she would have understood, unanswered, eternal, impossible to resolve. She remains forever frozen at 36, forever blonde, forever smiling that smile that promised everything and delivered nothing but heartbreak. The little girl who wanted to be loved became the woman everyone desired and no one saved. The foster child who dreamed of mattering became the most photographed person of her era, her image reproduced billions of times, her actual self increasingly invisible beneath the layers of mythology. What did she want? She wanted to be loved. From her earliest memories of foster homes and institutions, through her marriages and affairs and professional triumphs, she sought the love that had been promised and withheld since birth. She sought it from husbands who could not provide it, from audiences who could only worship from a distance, from influential men who saw her as a conquest rather than a person. She wanted to be taken seriously. She wanted her intelligence recognized, her artistic ambitions validated, her contributions to cinema understood as more than physical. She studied acting with the dedication of a scholar. She read philosophy and literature. She surrounded herself with intellectuals who could engage her mind. But the world insisted on seeing only the body, only the blonde, only the breathless symbol that she had created to survive. She wanted children. The miscarriages that devastated her represented more than physical loss. They represented the death of a dream, the dream of becoming the mother she had never had, of creating a family that would not abandon her, of breaking the cycle of madness and neglect that had defined her bloodline. She wanted a home. The Brentwood bungalow she purchased in early 1962 was the first property she had ever owned. She decorated it herself, choosing Mexican tiles and simple furnishings, creating a space that was hers alone. She died there within months of moving in. She wanted to matter, not as a symbol or a scandal or a cautionary tale, but as a human being whose existence had meaning beyond entertainment. She tried to use her platform for something beyond self-promotion. The world remembers the image, not the woman. Perhaps most of all, she wanted to reconcile the two people she had become. Norma Jeane and Marilyn existed in constant tension, each demanding what the other could not provide. Norma Jeane wanted privacy, authenticity, genuine connection. Marilyn demanded public performance, constant transformation, the maintenance of an image that had become a prison. "I'm not Marilyn Monroe," she told interviewers repeatedly. "Marilyn is someone I invented. I'm still trying to find out who I really am." She never found out. The invention consumed the inventor. The mask became the face. The performance became permanent, impossible to remove even in private, even in the moments she most desperately wanted to be real. This is the tragedy beneath all the other tragedies. Not the early death, though that was devastating. Not the exploitation, though that was constant. Not the abandonment by lovers and institutions, though that was crushing. The deepest tragedy is that she created something so overwhelming it destroyed her ability to exist apart from it. She was extraordinary, not just beautiful, though she was that, not just talented, though she was that too. She was extraordinary in her determination to become something more than circumstances allowed. She fought studios and husbands, and a system designed to use women like her and discard them. She won battles that no one expected her to win. She created an image so enduring that it outlasted everyone who tried to own it. She was also human, fragile, frightened, desperate for love that never came in the form she needed. She made mistakes. She hurt people. She could not overcome the wounds that had been inflicted before she was old enough to defend herself. The madness in her blood whispered to her constantly, and she spent her life trying not to listen. In the end, she did not triumph, but she did not entirely lose either. The image she created remains, 6 decades later, as potent and recognizable as anything in American culture. The films she made continue to bring joy to audiences who were not born when she died. The questions she raised about celebrity and exploitation and the destruction of women who become too visible remain urgent, unanswered, essential. She wanted to matter, she does. She wanted to be remembered, she is. She wanted to be loved, and in the strange, inadequate way that the world loves its icons from a distance, through images, without ever touching the human being at the center, she is loved still. It is not the love she wanted. It is not the love anyone deserves, but it endures when everything else has faded. It brings flowers to her grave and crowds to her films and attention to her story, decade after decade, generation after generation. Norma Jeane Mortensen was born on June 1, 1926. She spent 36 years trying to become someone worthy of love. She succeeded beyond anyone's imagination and failed in the ways that mattered most. She left behind an image that will not fade and questions that will not be answered, and a sadness that lingers in every photograph, every film clip, every iteration of that famous face. The telephone sat beside her like a promise never kept. She had dialed a number. She had waited for someone to answer. Somewhere in the darkness, in the pills and the despair and the accumulated weight of 36 years of reaching, she stopped waiting. Or someone stopped her. We will never know which. That face is why we cannot forget her. That longing is why the story never ends.